Okay, for the second part of this chapter 6, we talked about democracy at the beginning. I wanted to get into a couple of other different forms of government, namely totalitarianism and authoritarianism. Now, if you think about it, if democracy is on this side of the scale, and if it is over to one side, democracy being choice, democracy being equality, democracy, when you think about it, being majority rules and minority rights and accountability. If you go all the way over here to the other side of the scale, this is now where you're going to begin to get into totalitarianism, because it's very, very different. Let me give you a couple of quotes basically to introduce this. And as you look at this on page 105, and I'll begin to read several of these things off. This is the second line on page 105. Actually, the first line. In totalitarian systems, elites are almost completely unaccountable. They lock themselves into power and are very difficult to oust short of regime collapse. And Eastern Europe and the Soviet Union would probably be examples of this. Think about that. Elites. Instead of it being the rule by the people, instead of it being majority rules, instead of it being minority rights, you're really talking about elites that are basically running things. You're talking about the select few. Maybe these are the political leaders that are the best connected. Maybe these are the political leaders that come from the right families. Maybe these are political leaders that are very wealthy or backed by wealthy folks, but it's elites that are basically making the decisions for the masses. In a more common way of thinking about it, think about your own lives. If you deal with somebody who says jump and you say how high, that's what a totalitarian system is. It's not why do you want me to jump, it's how high do you want me to jump, because I know if I don't do it the right way, then in fact I'm probably going to be oppressed or maybe even killed. To give you a couple of other quotes, and this is just going down a couple of lines, it says, totalitarianism, its emphasis on total control, brainwashing, and worship of the state and its leaders has proven mistaken and inefficient. Think about that. Brainwashing, total control, and worship. When you think about the United States, we put our presidents on money. But when you look at the money that we have, all of the money is basically set up so that the presidents are dead before they're placed on it. And the idea is that we don't want to raise our presidents to too high of a level while they're alive, because we might think that if they're too glorified, that in fact we might be less inclined to disagree with them. We might be more inclined to defer to them when we think or know, in fact, that maybe they're making the wrong decisions. You go to a totalitarian country and you're going to see this worship idea. You're going to see this brainwashing idea. You're going to see leaders while they're actually serving in office on the money. You're going to see large posters and placards and in fact things that cover the sides of buildings that are basically glorifying the leader. At some level in a totalitarian system, they're going to try and make you think, whether you're conscious of it or not, that the leader is something more than just a man or more than just a woman, but this leader is above all of us. Not just because they're the leader, but in fact they're the leader because they're above all of us. And that's a dangerous thing to have. To give you a couple of other quotes, and this is actually probably the best one in terms of a definition of totalitarianism. And this is the first full indented paragraph on 106. It says, totalitarianism, a word coined by outside analysts in the 1930s, is a system in which one party holds total power and attempts to restructure society in accordance with party values. Freedom disappears. The old autocratic rulers kept their subjects quiet, but the totalitarian state insists on mass enthusiasm. Think about this in terms of somebody like Adolf Hitler back in the day. If you go back and you look at Hitler, Hitler was an incredible speech giver. He gave speeches that really raised the feeling of the German people in the aftermath of World War I. He made them feel good about being German again. He made them feel very strong and nationalistic. And in fact, the country began to recover very strongly in the aftermath of World War I. Problem, though, was that in this enthusiasm that he generated, he also picked out scapegoats. And obviously the Holocaust was taking place around this time, so that would have been a good example of one of the Holocausts. In order to feel better about yourself, sometimes you've got to bring other people down, maybe even dehumanize them to a certain extent, and Hitler and that totalitarian state did this. What you see, and talking about this mass enthusiasm, talking about this idea of we're going to restructure society, ideology is a big key up here. And the key with ideology is it's either black or white. You're either pregnant or you're not. You're either with me or you're against me. And when you're in a totalitarian state, if you're with the state, they're going to look out for you to a certain extent. They're going to take care of you to a certain extent. They're going to protect you to a certain extent. But if you don't offer that absolute ideological acceptance, that absolute ideological support, that worship almost of the state, in fact, you're going to be white when they're black to a certain extent, they're going to come after you as well. And that's what you saw in a totalitarian state. Freedom disappears. The idea of legitimate choice disappears. The idea of minority rights disappears. The idea of freedom of speech or press or even debate and discussion, these disappear, because if you're not with us, then you're against us. And if you're saying things that are against us, then in fact, we don't want you here. So when you look at this, it's either black or white. I mentioned no choice. No choice at all. Hitler was actually democratically elected. People forget about this. He was actually a democratically elected leader, and it got to the point where he appealed to the people so much. I am doing this for you. Give me more power to help you, kind of a thing. And because the country had been rebounding, they did, in fact. Well, ultimately, these elections were done away with. There wasn't choice. He wasn't democratically elected at the end, although he ironically was at the beginning. Weapons and communication. Think about it like this. The United States today has the Second Amendment, and if you think that there are some terrorist issues in other countries where they have strong limits on weapons, imagine the terrorist situation here in the United States if we ever got invaded because so many Americans are armed. Well, if you go back to these totalitarian countries, like in Nazi Germany, for instance, the government, the state apparatus, controlled the weapons. So in fact, if you disagreed, it's not like you could really do anything as an individual about it. It's not like you could actually organize people because weapons weren't accessible to you. So this was another way that the state basically consolidated its power. It had massive propaganda campaigns. They consolidated the weapons. They intimidated the population. As the chapter says, freedom disappears. Autocratic rulers basically forced mass into, we're doing this for you, give us the power. And in fact, once people began to realize that they had given up too much power, it was too late to really change. Now the last piece up here is this idea of communications. And when you look at communications, a couple of quick points on this. Those propaganda campaigns. I mentioned to you the money in the United States. Believe it or not, it's even a controversy to try and put up a picture, a portrait of a living president in a public school. And again, the idea is that if you put these pictures up, in fact, guess what? You, at that point, are now going to be, as a younger child, socialized that the president is maybe somewhat bigger than what he actually is. Propaganda or communications campaigns were as subtle as these pictures. They were subtle as party references, but they were also very, very blatant in terms of controlling the media, controlling broadcasts, controlling publications. There were certain government messages that they wanted to get out. So keep in mind, totalitarianism has got some tentacles that you might say that could get into all levels of society. Again, if democracy is over here on this left-hand side, where there is this idea of choice and this idea of rights and this idea of majority, totalitarian is over here, and they believe in absolute total control. And the irony is that they actually persuade you based on enthusiasm to give this control. And in fact, they prey on the fact that you get so excited about what the government can and has done, and then progressively you vote away things to the point where there's no going back. Very few totalitarian systems are around today, but that doesn't mean that they're ever going to completely go away.